Ontario, a province hit hard by Donald Trump's tariffs.
The stakes have never been higher for our economy. In Canada, there are tariffs that remain in place. Those tariffs are threatening our families, our workers, and our businesses.
It remains a mystery why the President treats Canada worse than dozens of other faraway countries who are not America's best friend.
Also today, policy pitches that in any other election might have dominated this campaign. The Conservatives tackled housing, the Liberals targeted crime, while the NDP went after the Liberal leader.
His plan is to cut these things that you care about. At the same time, he wants to give bigger cuts to millionaires and billionaires. He wants to give them tax cuts while he cuts your services.
All the polls now point to a Liberal victory on April 28th. But has this election really locked in? We're going to dig into all of that as Power and Politics starts right now. All right, we've got the Power Panel standing by to dig into all of today's developments. There they are, a day that's centered on battleground Ontario today, with both the Liberal and the Conservative leaders appealing for support in the key ridings of the Greater Toronto Area. Mark Carney announced his policy on crime today in Brampton before heading to Hamilton to meet with supporters and volunteers.
Tariffs are not the only American policies that are threatening our economy and our society. Criminals are taking advantage of irresponsible American gun laws and their weak border enforcement to bring illegal guns into Canada.
Carney made a number of promises today to crack down on crime, one day after his Conservative rival announced his own tough on crime agenda. The CBC's Catherine Tunney is with the Liberal leaders campaign. Catherine.
David, in a campaign dominated by tariffs and Trump, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has wanted to talk about public safety, making tough on crime policies a cornerstone of his pitch to Canadians. Well, today, Liberal leader Mark Carney also wanted to talk about the issue, an area the Liberals haven't always been seen as the strongest on. Speaking at Sheridan College, Carney pledged to toughen bail conditions for violent car thefts, home invasions, and human trafficking. There was also a big emphasis in today's announcement on firearms. Carney promised if re-elected, the Liberals would recruit more Mounties and hire more border agents. Part of his promise, a crackdown on guns coming into Canada. Carney also recommitted to the buyback program, a file that has been, frankly, a political mess for the Liberals, taking years to get off the ground following tensions with gun owners, the provinces, and even Canada Post. Carney took aim at Poilievre, saying the Conservative leader can't say he's tough on crime or take intimate partner violence seriously without talking about gun control. Carney brought his message to Brampton, where crime has been identified as a key issue, just hours after Poilievre visited the region and held a rally leaning on his anti-crime message. Both parties are seeking support in the vote-rich GTA. David?
All right, Catherine, thanks so much. That's the CBC's Catherine Tunney in Brampton, Ontario with the Liberals today. Also in the Toronto region today, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. He began day 19 of this campaign in Milton, pitching his plan to build more homes and cut crime rates. Tonight, Poilievre holds a rally in a rural township outside of Waterloo.
Like Justin Trudeau, Mark Carney simply doesn't understand the struggles of ordinary Canadians who are priced out of their communities and out of the dream of home ownership. We cannot afford a fourth Liberal term of doubling housing costs. We need a new government for a change.
Poilievre announced details about his plan to make homes more affordable. The CBC's Marina von Stackelberg is covering the Poilievre campaign. Marina.
Hey David, a very snowy day here in Milton, a fast-growing community in the southwest edge of the Greater Toronto Area, where housing is a major concern. Pierre Poilievre announced his latest plan to deal with the housing crisis inside a half-built condo in a new development behind me here. Now, he says a Conservative government would reward municipalities if they cut their development fees. Now, cities collect this money to pay for surrounding infrastructure, think roads, sewers, but these fees have gone up rapidly across Canada over the last few years, and Poilievre says they are too high. So he's promising that for every dollar that municipalities cut of these fees, a Conservative government would match up to $25,000 per home. Now, the Conservatives have previously said they would also take away federal infrastructure money from big cities if they don't build new homes fast enough. I should say it's politically significant that Poilievre is making this kind of announcement here. We're actually in a new riding of Milton East, Halton Hills South. This will likely be a battleground seat. Suburban Toronto and Southern Ontario is incredibly important to anyone trying to win an election. There are a lot of ridings here, and they tend to swing between the Liberals and Conservatives. Right now, many of these seats are red, and so it's likely the Poilievre team will continue to campaign in this area, hoping to turn them blue. David?
All right, thank you, Marina. That's the CBC's Marina von Stackelberg traveling with the Conservative campaign. So the Liberals and the Conservatives are in battleground Ontario today, which is probably the ball game for much of this election, both talking about issues that have dominated the public's concern before Donald Trump returned as president and will likely persist after. So these are the latest poll numbers from the CBC poll tracker in Ontario. We're just looking at Ontario right now. The Liberals, as you saw there, they were ahead by 10 points. Okay, we're going to begin there with the power panel. James Moore is a former Conservative cabinet minister. Andrew Thompson is a former Saskatchewan NDP cabinet minister. And here with me in the studio, Cameron Ahmad was a head of communications to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and Sherelle Evelyn is the managing editor of The Hill Times. All right, good to see you all. James, let's start with you. I mean, Ontario, there's no Conservative victory without a big breakthrough here in Ontario. Those numbers show a pretty tough path. I mean, what's your sense of the state of the Conservative campaign right now?
Well, I mean, look, it's a fight for sure. You know, 1 in 3 Canadians live in the province of Ontario. It's battleground 416, battleground 905. Pierre Poilievre's been a politician from the province of Ontario. I think he understands what's needed there. But obviously, there's a lot of debate about how to most effectively reach out to the people of the GTA. Focusing on housing is a good thing for the generational voters who have been accessible to Conservatives over the past little while. But, you know, there's still a lot of time on the clock. The leaders' debates will matter. And it's a tough fight.
Andrew, what are your thoughts? As someone who is in, as we call it, the vote-rich GTA or vote-rich Ontario, whatever cliche we all fall back on during election campaigns. We just call it Toronto mostly. What are your thoughts?
I just call it home. But it's, yeah, I mean, this is certainly an interesting set of issues to be bringing up here. I'm still not sure that this is the ballot question in Ontario. Very much focused still on the economic, potential economic impact that the tariffs are going to have. So bringing some of these secondary questions forward, I think, are showing either that is waning as a ballot question, or that they are desperately trying to reposition to get it focused onto other things. I'm just not sure at this point. I mean, when we look at what's shaping up across the country, that the map looks tougher for the Conservatives. It looks, I mean, Ontario is always going to have a bit of a fight here. Obviously, the lower mainland of BC is competitive. If you believe what the polls are saying, people at Poilievre rallies seem not to, but if you do, it looks like even places like the small cities across the prairies and the large cities, Edmonton and Calgary, are starting to become more competitive. So, I mean, everything's in play at this point, and I think that's what you're seeing the politicians do.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Luckily, nobody here is wearing any of those hoodies. Cameron, your thoughts on where this race is right now? I mean, a 10-point lead in Ontario, considering where this year started for your team. I mean, what do you make of how things stand today?
I mean, I think obviously the Liberals have had the wind in their sails since the beginning of the campaign and since right before. And the Conservatives are now faced with, for the first time in, nearly 2 years, being, in second place in the polls. This is not the attitude or the posture that the Conservative leader has adopted as the underdog who's fighting from behind since he's been leading in the polls. But I still think that everything is, across the country, extremely competitive. Nothing should be taken for granted, especially now in this context politically and internationally where the President of the United States is largely dictating the terms of what we talk about in this election, and so many more things can happen, debates can happen, other unforeseen events. So nothing should be declared at this stage, but of course it is an uphill battle for the Conservatives, and I think whether Pierre Poilievre can redefine himself, frankly, and show that he is more of a rassembleur, someone who can bring people together as opposed to an aggressive attack dog, who is, who name calls all the time. That's probably the only thing that can really turn his image around for a lot of people who are on the fence.
Well, Sherelle, we've seen a lot of those calls from Conservatives for the Conservative leader to go in that direction, and there have been some moments of it, but broadly, it still sort of reverts back to form. I mean, what are your thoughts on a meaningful change like that happening at this more than halfway through this?
Well, I guess it kind of depends on what you count as a meaningful change. I mean,
well, meaningful with the voters.
With the voters, for sure. Yeah, because I don't know if we're going to see a real shift in terms of, the leader of the Conservative Party, his demeanor, his stance, his approach. He has acknowledged that, he said that sometimes his passion can come out as hostility, I believe is how he put it, but that he was going to be trying to adopt a more hopeful tone. I'm not sure if we've seen that yet, but Ontario is an interesting case because, there was just a provincial election here, and the ballot question there was obviously there are some real differences in the types of governments that provincial voters, Ontario voters are voting for provincial government versus a federal government, what they're going to be looking for. But Premier Doug Ford, he fought that election pretty much solely on dealing with the Canada-U.S. issue. Things like housing, things like crime, things that are also in provincial purview weren't really that much of a ballot box issue. So I do think it's important for parties to be putting these platforms out because people do need to look at them and people do need to scrutinize them because these could be the things that could be driving our country for the next 4 years. But when it comes to what are the things that Ontario voters specifically are looking at, it's a little hard to gauge as to what they think is actually important right now.
Well, like certainly southwestern Ontario, I think it's the trade exposure from, Windsor to Hamilton, Kitchener and all those areas. I mean, that's got to be driving things, right, in terms of like people who live in auto towns or supply auto towns. So, James, I wonder about this, like, Look, the polls have shifted dramatically, right? This 25-point lead, when the Liberals were at their absolute lowest point, and probably it was an overinflated Conservative number. A lot of shy Liberals went there who've now gone back, and then Bloc and NDPers have gone to the Liberals. The Conservative numbers kind of held. So was there a course correction or an issue correction or a tonal correction they could have made in this campaign to this point, you think? Or was it just the issue set changed and soft progressives have rallied around the Liberals?
Well, look, the campaign isn't over yet, right?
Of course,
Hillary Clinton had a 99% probability of winning the election 3 hours before she lost. So everything is still on the table, to Cameron's point.
Yes.
A lot of time left in the campaign. Conservatives have a great ground organization. They have lots of things that they can talk about in the debate to distinguish themselves from Mark Carney. If there was a pivot point, I mean, I think two things retrospectively that they might have done. One is one thing, which is it's very difficult to be the leader of the opposition in the country. It's one of the hardest jobs in Canada to be the opposition leader. And if you're seen as being the principal critic, it's very difficult in the same press conference or in the same media moment to then be seen as a prime ministerial candidate. I've always been of the view that when you decouple optimism from conservatism fails. And Pierre has always been at the peak of his powers when he is putting a positive vision forward about an energy corridor, making Canada tax competitive, helping people build homes, making streets safer, allowing people to have access to more opportunity, making sure that new Canadians have full access to the economy in Canada from coast to coast. These are all really good, positive messages that I think resonate well. Yesterday, when Donald Trump said that he was going to do a 90-day timeout on the global tariffs, but Canada was still, we're still at risk in steel and aluminum and autos. I think there was an opportunity over the past 24 hours for the Conservative campaign to sort of repivot and reposition the campaign to say, there's been a 90-day timeout, but Canada has been left behind. I will make sure Canada is not left behind. And I will make sure that in the 90 days when Donald Trump seems to be prepared to reconsider what he's going to do globally, that Canada will be positioned to be strong and sturdy to withstand whatever Donald Trump may pivot to going forward, and we will make every effort to ensure that the steel, aluminum, and auto sectors will be fortified and have full access to the American economy moving forward. I think there's a window of opportunity to position the first 100 days of a Pierre Poilievre administration and what it may look like in terms of a positive vision for the economy. And I'm surprised that today they sort of went back to what they were talking about last year and the year before, which was building homes and kind of missing a communications moment given what we're seeing in the United States.
Well, I guess part of the risk is the 90 days may not last 90 minutes after you say it because it is Donald Trump, so there is that to your point. But just Andy, your quick thoughts.
But you take your communications windows as they appear. And
gotcha.
This is where we are.
No, I think you make a good point there. Andrew, just your quick thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, housing is a vulnerability for the Liberals. I mean, this is the big question as to, okay, so what's changed? You've changed the leader. They've been very effective at, focusing on the ballot question, or a ballot question. They've also been very good at taking away those things that Canadians hated about the Trudeau government. You know, the carbon tax, the extension of the capital gains. What they've not been able to explain thus far in the campaign is what are they actually going to do that's different, that's going to solve the housing problem? What are they actually going to do that's different, that fixes people's concerns about public safety and crime? And what is it that's different about this government that couldn't get done under the Trudeau government? That's a tough question for Carney to answer, because there's no way to easily answer that without throwing half your cabinet under the bus, or with completely pivoting in a way that doesn't seem genuine and authentic. So I think that this is, not an entirely bad strategy on the part of the Conservatives to start bringing this up, but it does start to, I think, draw us back to a point where it's like, well, is that really what I'm focused on at this point?
Okay, we've got to hold the conversation there, but a perfect segue, because we have a Minister of the Cabinet standing by. Because on day 19 of the election campaign, the Liberals and the Conservatives are promising to crack down on crime. Both parties say they'll also strengthen bail laws to keep repeat and violent offenders in jail.
What I'm saying is get rid of the revolving door and replace it with an iron gate. The rampant offenders, they will be locked up for good where they belong. That is how we're going to stop the crime.
To ensure that Canadians feel safe in their homes and communities, we will make bail harder to get. We will toughen sentencing guidelines for repeat offenders charged in relation to stolen cars and to violent and organized crime.
Okay, we're going to talk more about this issue because standing by to join us is Liberal Party candidate and Minister of National Defence, Bill Blair. You can see him there. Bill Blair, it's good to see you, sir. I want to start with the bail reforms that are part of this law and order plan. Your party's promising to put a reverse onus on certain offences for bail. But to this point, your party has been pretty consistent in saying the bail measures that exist under C-75 under the current laws have been good enough and done the job. How do you square this new proposal with the past statements of members of your cabinet?
Well, I can tell you that I've been involved, David, in a number of discussions with the Prime Minister and with our entire team. We've talked about what needs to be done to keep our communities safe, and the measures that the Prime Minister announced today are exactly what is required to ensure that our prosecutors, our courts, and the police have the tools that are necessary in order to deal with people's concerns and legitimate concerns about crime and violence in their communities, strengthening the law as it pertains to bail, the reverse onus, placing the onus on the offender to show why they should be released, and empowering our courts to make the right decisions with respect to bail is exactly what is required. Quite frankly, what is not required is slogans and sort of vacuous statements that don't really amount to anything. This is real action, David, and I've been meeting with the Prime Minister and his team. I spent most of my life in public safety. I was a detective for 20 years before I was the chief of police.
Right.
And I've been in those bail courts, and I believe that the measures that are proposed today will be a very effective response to concerns that Canadians have with respect to repeat offenders getting out on bail.
Right, so you're talking about making it harder for people charged with violent car theft for a criminal organization, home invasion. But I go back to past statements you made, Minister, in 2018 about C-75, about how the bill seeks to reduce the imposition of bail conditions that are unreasonable. It encodes the principle of restraint. People have been calling for actions like this and changes like this on bail for years now. And the answer from the Liberals has always been that's going too far. We need to leave it to the judges. And you know, the laws that are in place were guided by decisions of the Supreme Court of Canada. This seems to acknowledge that those positions maybe weren't the right ones.
And David, there are things that the federal government can do. And for example, Prime Minister Carney mentioned today about strengthening the guidelines for sentencing that sends a very clear message to the courts of what our expectations are and the need to consider for sentencing the dangers of the individual and the likelihood of repeat offending. Right. Those are clear directions that can be given to the courts by the government that our judges can appropriately act upon. Now, and David, I think it's important to understand our detention facilities in every province right across this country are already crammed full of offenders, and I think the people we should be keeping in jail are the people not that we're angry at, but that we're afraid of. People who represent a real threat to our safety and to the safety of our communities. And we're making sure that the law is in place and the tools are provided to the police, to our prosecutors, and our courts to make sure that we can make the right decision with respect to these dangerous individuals and keep them in custody, because quite frankly, the full force of the law needs to be dealt with appropriately for those repeat and violent offenders. But at the same time, I think we have to trust the police. We have to trust our prosecutors, and we have to trust our courts. But we can also provide them with the resources they need. The Prime Minister announced 1,000 new RCMP officers, for example, with additional resources for our public prosecution services and for clear direction for our judges to make the right determination with respect to violent offenders.
Okay, but you talked about, this is the part where you talk about toughening sentencing guidelines. We're directing courts to primarily consider denunciation and deterrence when sentencing repeat car thieves, for example. Your government has always in the past pushed back against the mandatory minimums proposed by the Conservatives. I know that's not what this is, but the argument has been judicial discretion is important, leave it to the judges, and now you're bringing in new sentencing directions. Like, I know it's not as far as what the Conservatives want to go, but it is trying to tell judges a little bit more clearly what they should be doing with their discretion, is it not?
And David, our courts, our Supreme Court has been very clear about the constitutional issues that arise from mandatory minimums, because quite frankly, it's a very blunt approach. I think it sounds good politically, but it doesn't actually work. But what does work is providing very clear direction through sentencing guidelines, and we can do that within the law, to let judges know that how they must prioritize deterrence and the protection of our communities in their sentencing guidelines. I think that's the right way to do it. It will also, I'm very confident, it will have the support of our Supreme Court. It will be charter compliant, but it also will do the job of helping our police, our prosecutors, and our courts protect citizens from violent offenders.
But the broad direction of this, with reverse onus and tougher sentencing guidelines, is that more people will spend more time in jail longer, is inevitably where this would go. And you said yourself, they're overflowing, there's not enough space, there's problems with conditions, and this is why the principle of restraint was something your government championed in the past. So how do you square that?
Yeah, no, very, very simply. And again, I have spent a great deal of my life in those courts and in those bail courts and testifying. There are some individuals, David, who represent a significant threat to community safety. And those individuals require the full force of the law and all of the concerted efforts of our police, our prosecutors, and our courts to protect society from the danger that they represent. And at the same time, there are a number of other offenders who don't represent that threat to public safety. And we should, where appropriate, make sure that we are dealing with those individuals as expeditiously and appropriately as possible. But when they don't represent a significant threat to our safety, there are other ways to manage their presence in our society through bail conditions and for the proper enforcement of those conditions. But there are some people that the only deterrence and the necessary protection of society requires that they be incarcerated. And we've got to make sure that the law is able, and the police, our prosecutors, and the courts are able to deal appropriately with those guys and keep them in custody. And at the same time, I think we also have to be balanced and reasonable in how we manage the vast majority of offenders who don't represent a significant risk to public safety. There are ways, in my experience, to manage that through bail conditions. It's an important responsibility of the police. And David, I will tell you, I believe, and I've known from 40 years of experience in keeping people safe, cops count. And when the Prime Minister announced, for example, that we are going to add 1,000 new RCMP officers, that's important because I remember too vividly back in 2013 when Mr. Harper cut over 1,000 RCMP officers, cut nearly 1,000 border security officers, closed down every integrated proceeds of crime unit across the country. They did it to save money, and they put us at risk.
Right, but you are now taking steps to deal with violent car theft from criminal organization, home invasion, human trafficking, and smuggling offenses. These have been issues that have been discussed in Parliament for years. So, you were criticized as a government for not taking action on it. I mean, what do you say to people in the GTA and Brampton, where Mr. Carney was today, who are skeptical that it took an election campaign to get to this level of commitment?
David, I would simply remind them that our government actually took action last year. There's been a significant reduction, for example, in car theft in this country. And the reason for that significant reduction is because we made investments in the police. We made investments in our border security. We worked very hard in order to bring that down. The ways to prevent car theft is make it harder to commit the crime, more likely to get caught, and the serious consequences for getting caught. We've been addressing those things, and what Prime Minister Carney has proposed today is to build upon that effort to finish the job of making sure that our police have the resources that they need, our prosecutors are able to target those violent offenders and repeat offenders who continue to plague our communities, and that our courts have the clear direction and the resources that they need to deal appropriately with those individuals. You know, this isn't something that just began in this campaign. It's work that we undertook when car theft and particularly violent car theft began to increase. Okay. There's also important measures that the Prime Minister spoke about today too, about protecting children, about protecting people in intimate partner violence and domestic violence situations, and to deal more effectively with gun crime and gun violence through stricter gun control. All of those measures build upon the work that we have done, but it's also a response to the very legitimate and understandable concerns that Canadians are expressing to us.
Mr. Blair, I'm out of time, but I have to ask a question about the cabinet meeting, the cabinet committee meeting that's going to be happening tomorrow. The counter tariffs are in place because of the auto tariffs, steel and aluminum tariffs. Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, said yesterday, I have no idea if this is still the live position of the U.S. government, but I'm going to put it to you. He suggested that China didn't fare well when it retaliated, and maybe Canada might want to think about its retaliatory tariffs. Is there a thought process, or is there a world in which this government might drop its counter tariffs with the U.S. based on the events of the last 48 hours or so?
Our tariffs were, in fact, reciprocal and a counter to the tariffs that were imposed against our country, contrary to the agreement of the CUSMA agreement against our country. There was a conversation clearly between the Prime Minister and President Trump in which this was discussed, and an agreement was reached between the leaders of both of our countries to reconvene after this election and to begin the important discussion of renegotiating, if necessary, the CUSMA agreement and to address those tariffs. I believe that the response that we have undertaken has been proportional, necessary. We have to. And
it will stay in place, you think, sir?
I believe that it is important that we show that we are able to respond forcefully, and we will do what is required to defend our citizens, our workers, our economy. And I believe that President Trump actually respects that. And you saw a change in his demeanor and his approach to this country after his conversation with Prime Minister Carney, because I think it's very clear to the President that he knows he's dealing with an adult, an experienced man who's prepared to come and have those important conversations with him after our election.
Okay, Liberal candidate Bill Blair, we appreciate you taking the time to join us today. That's Bill Blair. We did ask for a Conservative candidate to talk about their crime policy, but no one was made available. Now, on the campaign trail today, Pierre Poilievre took aim at Mark Carney over his ability to handle Donald Trump and all of those tariffs.
Prime Minister Carney boasted that he had had a productive call with President Trump and that he had made, quote, progress. What progress? There are more tariffs, American tariffs, on Canada today than there were when Prime Minister Carney took office, while dozens of other countries have secured pauses.
Okay, Trump did not pause tariffs on the other countries. He's holding back a higher tariff rate for 90 days. He still put a 10% base tariff on the dozens of countries that Poilievre is referring to there. Those so-called, as Trump calls them, reciprocal tariffs also never applied to Canada in the first place. So that's just where we are. It's still the auto, steel, and the fentanyl tariffs, for lack of a better term. Carney today reiterated his plan to sit down with the president after this election, should he win.
We have agreed to begin negotiations between the Prime Minister and the President immediately following the election, and we will ensure that the ground for those negotiations is constructive while we stand firm with our workers, protecting our workers, and building this economy.
And Mark Carney will be in Ottawa tomorrow to meet with his Cabinet Committee on Canada-U.S. relations. As you just heard, we talked to Bill Blair. We're going to bring back the power panel. They were listening to Bill Blair and all of this. James Moore, Andrew Thompson, Cameron Ahmad, and Sherelle Evelyn. Andrew, you mentioned you didn't hear much about what they're going to do on crime going into that. What do you make of where they are now after they've moved on bail from where they were going into this election? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think they are trying to recalibrate. There's no doubt that this is an issue. But they're boxed in a little bit because, as you pointed out, they've had years of policy positions that they have stuck to and fought, fairly vigorously for. Now they're starting to take a slightly different posture, and I think what you heard was, a minister attempting to defend that in the middle of an election campaign. I don't know that it's really much more than that. I mean, the initiatives that are being proposed by the Liberals all sound generally good. I'm not sure, frankly, that they're very much different than what we would see from a Conservative government one way or the other.
Cameron, it is a shift, right? I mean, I have interviewed Bill Blair about this, David Lametti, others, you know, Ari Farani, and they stood by the bail changes in C-75, and now in the middle of a campaign, suddenly they're getting aggressive on a few things.
Well, I mean, first of all, crime, as Andrew said, is a real issue in the country, especially in big cities. It's something that the government has to acknowledge to be credible on public safety. I think Bill Blair is actually a fantastic messenger on this, not only because of how he communicates, he did a really good job in answering your questions there, but he also has a very strong track record and background. I mean, there are a few people in public office who have as much experience in public safety and in policing that as him. When I look through Mr. Carney's announcement today, it comes across as a very comprehensive, and yes, on bail there are new measures, but they are quite targeted compared to what the Conservatives are proposing. Which a lot of experts, criminal justice experts and lawyers have called out for being expensive, potentially unconstitutional, and we'll see how many more of those critiques emerge and whether the Liberals get them too. But bringing it back to the end of your interview there, the ultimate question that's going to define this election is comprehensively, which party do you trust to navigate the country through a trade war and an economic crisis? And so they have to talk about these issues. It is responsible for them to talk about and outline detailed plans about all the big issues that Canadians care about. But at the end of the day, the only real issue, I think, that is going to define people's choice over who they trust is who is competent, who is credible, who is calm and can bring the country together faced with growing, constant chaos generated by south of the border.
Well, and Sherelle, it seems like Mark Carney is going to return to Ottawa to campaign again from maybe the Prime Minister's lectern, right? He's going to have his cabinet meeting tomorrow, probably speak after that. You know, in some capacity, it's a relentless focus. Like, I mean, you have to deal with the issue, but also to make it the issue of the day for the Liberal campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, and there's polling data that kind of backs that up. I'm going to forget now exactly which company, so forgive me. But, you know, the people who care the most about the Canada-US relationship feel that it's permanently altered forever and feel that, you know, how the Canada deals with its American neighbor, they are the ones who are most likely going to be coming out to vote. They are the older Canadians, the ones who traditionally have a higher turnout. And they are also the ones who are looking at Mark Carney the most favorably. So these are the people that they want to capture their attention. So of course they're going to, you know, pound the pavement on this, and they're going to, you know, do the stump speech. It's an interesting balance simply because, yes, we're in the middle of a campaign, but yes, we're also dealing with, you know, this crisis and threat from across the border. So you cannot do one and ignore the other. You have to do both. And given the fact that Mark Carney is in the Prime Minister's office, he has this pulpit, he's going to use it. Pierre Poilievre has said, you know, this is a distraction and that and that Mark Carney is using, and, you know, be that as it may. It's hard to call it a distraction when it is the thing that is occupying the brains of so many people right now across the country.
Yeah, look, there's no question, like James, that this election was going to be a change election. Now it's kind of a leadership to deal with the Trump election. But you're seeing there, like on the bail policies, change from the Liberals again, right? And I know it's a new leader and it can take things in a new direction. But a lot of these law and order things are issues that Pierre Poilievre has owned and been raising consistently. And it's only now that there's movement on those particular offenses from the Liberals.
Well, it's shades of Prime Minister Chrétien, right? The Reform Party, Canadian Alliance, Conservative parties in the past would put forward detailed policies, and Prime Minister Chrétien would look at them, and then he'd scoop out a couple, 2, 3 that he thinks are that he can sell to his own base, and then present them to the public as his own. But however, you know, to the point, I think some of the questions you were asking Minister Blair, there's a, you know, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. Mr. Blair, again, who is former chief of the Toronto Police Services and who's actually worn the uniform and has faced a lot of things that I've never put on the uniform and faced, so I certainly respect his prerogative. But in the past 10 years, as a political leader, as a cabinet minister, as a parliamentary secretary to the justice minister, as a minister of public safety, he didn't do any of these things. He had the full opportunity to do this in a majority Liberal government. He had the full opportunity through 3 successive parliaments. And now he says, if you give me a 4th parliament, give me a 4th mandate, and I really will do it this time. I mean, it's come on. It fails on the sincerity test and the credibility test to say that if I didn't do it the first time, didn't do it the second time, didn't do it the 3rd time, but the 4th time, I really promise I'll get serious about this now. It's hard to imagine. I think Canadians will buy the bait.
Well, you know, Cameron, just on that, the very first bullet point in the press release is continue to implement an efficient gun buyback program for assault-style firearms. Is this the 3rd election in a row that's been in the platform? Like, this started with the 2019 campaign, if I remember correctly, did it not? And we're still not at the point, I think, where it's really doing anything.
Yeah, that policy obviously has faced some challenges. But look, to some of the points that James raised, I think you have to acknowledge that there are a multitude of policies required to deal with criminal justice issues and to deal with crime and to deal with the evolving nature of crime and how criminals behave in our country. And the Liberal government has faced plenty of criticism for its record on the rise in certain types of crime across the country. But they've also taken a lot of action on gun control. Some of the policies have not been as successful. Others have been more successful and have been demanded by gun control advocates and experts for a long time. I think what you saw today from Prime Minister Carney is a series of new measures too. I mean, he's addressing also online harms and crimes that are committed online to minors and to people who are abused online, deepfakes.
That was in the Parliament before the prorogation, and they had to split the bill to do the Solomon's baby thing because the speech component of it was a bit too messy, right? So do you see that as new or just
well, it's not things that we were talking about 5 or 10 years ago necessarily.
No, fair. Okay,
right?
sure. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, again, there are some policies here that are elements of policies that existed before and some new ones. But at the end of the day, I think the Conservatives like to talk about crime a lot more than Liberals do, and it's something that they are very aggressive on. I think they take a much more rigid approach to it, and that's why you saw Pierre Poilievre with his very aggressive tone today.
Cheryl, quick thoughts on that, and then I want to move to the next topic.
Well, there's a lot of things that are missing from both platforms. I know, where is the actual criminal justice system reform? There's talks about, cracking down. And we're talking about bail reform. Look at the people who are going to be disproportionately affected. These are not people who've been, convicted of things. These are people who have been arrested and charged and are and waiting their day in court. And the people who are often in those places are the people who are, Indigenous, racialized, and, Black. So these are the people who need the most help. These are the people who need the most attention. And the only real, in the Liberal platform anyways, the only real mental health supports or anything like that, community support, is for first-line responders, which is important, but it's not going to help, we were talking about recidivism.
Can I just say quickly, I agree with everything you said, and I think the conversation about crime and criminal justice in Canada often doesn't include topics about involving the root causes and making sure that society is fairer and prevents a lot of the reasons that people commit crimes or fall into criminality.
Yes, and this is one component. There could be more components of the plan. We don't know. We don't have the full platform yet. But yes, to this point, Cheryl, you're dead right. Okay. Today, the main party leaders were asked whether or not they believe in the polls, which is, subjective, and, this is more important, if they will accept the results of the election no matter who wins.
Jeez, of course. We will have, and we are in the midst of a fair and open and free election in Canada. I am very pleased about the very high level of engagement of Canadians across this country in this election process.
Yes, and that decision will be based on whether, after a lost Liberal decade of rising crime and costs and a falling economy under America's thumb, we can afford a 4th Liberal term.
Obviously, we would accept the results of the election. We're New Democrats. Democracy is in our name, so of course we'd accept it. But in terms of the polls, we have a very recent example where many polls said that in Ontario, New Democrats would lose party status, and they formed official opposition. So of course, I've got my doubts about the way that covers our support, that our support is not accurately being represented.
Okay, this question all came up today because of a group of people who say they are going to follow the Conservative campaign throughout the GTA. This is a picture of them at Poilievre's rally in Brampton last night. Their sign reading, "Do you believe the polls?" Now, this is a group, this is not the party. I just want to make that very clear. A quick look at those polls now. These are the latest numbers from the poll tracker, the CBC's poll tracker, which has the Liberals maintaining that steady lead over the Conservatives, about 6 points or so there. So, Andrew, on this is not the Conservative Party doing this. This is people showing up in sweatshirts and hats. I want to make that very clear. But there is this growing movement online, too, you know, raising questions about rally sizes versus polls. And, you know, just what do you make of the potential for this to turn into a problem? Like, not necessarily a political problem, but just doubt in institutions and all of those things. How do you view this? Oh, hang on, Andrew, just 1 sec. I'm not hearing you. Is that here?
Oh.
All right, there you go. Try now. Yeah,
oh, okay.
Sorry. We were not trying to censor you, I promise.
Well,
go
those
ahead.
were one of my best comments. I just, in that last 2 seconds there. What I was going to say is, you know, there's a reason why people look at our electoral system and think that there are problems with it. I mean, the Conservatives have won the popular vote the last 2 elections, lost the seats, have not formed the government. I mean, there's inefficiency. We talk about efficiency and inefficiency in the vote. It's not entirely reflective. I mean, that's what's driving the whole question around, should we have a different voting system? I get some of where some Conservative supporters are looking at this and going, I don't get it. They have a highly motivated group of supporters who are turning out, who are putting up signs, who are active, and yet it doesn't seem to be showing up in the overall vote numbers. Why? Probably because a lot of soft New Democrats have switched over to supporting the Liberals, not particularly enthusiastically. They're not putting up Liberal signs by any means. And they may not turn out to vote that way. What we're getting is a snapshot right now in a poll that says, you know, where would you vote if you vote today? The question is, who's actually going to show up to vote? It's quite possible on election day that the Conservatives do have a tremendous turnout, and that actually makes a difference in seats. Conversely, it's possible that we're going to see, you know, the NDP vote, even though it's depressed down at something like 8% nationally, hold in those incumbent seats, or enough of those incumbent seats, that, as Jagmeet Singh says, you know, they will see MPs return to Ottawa. We just don't know yet, and that's always the problem when we go through this question about what the polls are saying, what the campaign is actually feeling like on the ground. And then, of course, there's this, you know, kind of other pseudoscience out there about seat projections, which are largely based on what happened in the last election, not what's happening in this election.
Yeah, and those are there's a big margin of error on those. But James,
absolutely.
Look, James, I want to make very clear, because someone's going to clip this and put it on social media, and Cochrane's trying to turn, you know, the Poilievre campaign to Trump stop the steal thing. They're not doing that at all. We don't know if this is just 6 or 7 people. We don't know how big it is, but like when you start seeing this pop up in an election, I don't know. I get a little bit worried just in general. What are your thoughts here?
Well, I got to say, if you don't know if it's 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 people, why are we platforming them on the national public broadcaster?
Well, because you know, it is also happening in some of the online publications on the right-wing things.
Sure.
But it does reach an audience of young men in particular, James, and it's how it starts, right? So I was just like, how do we deal with the resiliency of it, right?
Yeah, good save, but I don't think frankly, I don't think it should be platformed. But like my message to them would be, you know, instead of, you know, wasting your money on a banner and some hoodies and a ball cap, why don't you actually get involved in the political process? You know, to their question, do you believe in the polls? I don't believe in a poll. I believe in the aggregate of polls, and polls are, all of them, even in the aggregate, are snapshots of a flowing river, and they're no predictor of tomorrow. They're a snapshot of where we might be today when you take the sum of all of them and you look at the mean. But, you know, but if I assume these people, they want to be politically active. If you want to be politically active, then be politically active. Don't talk about the process. And take that money that you wasted on those hoodies and buy a tank of gas and volunteer for a political party you believe in and drive people to the polls and the advanced polls next weekend. Do something. Don't talk about things. Do something. Participate. Get involved. There's all kinds of ways you can do that. Hammering up signs, knocking on doors, handing out flyers, doing your thing. But, you know, whining about the process, even if it's 2 or 3 or 5 people, I mean, they can have a real impact in a local campaign. If they care about their country so much that they're going to stand out in the cold and wave a banner, then do it in a meaningful way.
James, look, and James, I take your point about why platform them, and we struggle with this, right? But like Sherelle, they can find a platform in the internet age and will get platformed. And sometimes if you ignore something because you don't want a platform, it takes root before it's revealed to people, you know? So I don't know the perfect answer here. So I don't know if this is meaningful or not. What are your thoughts on what you saw?
Yeah, it turns into, okay, well, you know, the mainstream media won't show you this, but, you know, here's the movement that's happening. So, I mean, Yeah, I take, and I also take James' point. Like, people want to be politically active. There's a lot of talk about, slacktivism and people who just get involved online and then say they've done something because they changed their profile picture to, a certain avatar. And these people probably seemed to believe these polls 6 months ago when the Conservatives were leading. So I don't know how much stock we should really be putting into that. But at the same time, it does indicate a movement. It indicates a feeling, and you have to look at the other side of the border where there are people who really believed that their electoral process and their election system, that something was wrong, and we see that creeping up across on our side of the border because people don't understand that our ballots aren't counted electronically, and they don't know how our own Canadian system works. So it is absolutely an opportunity to inform people about our democratic system and how that works and keep that at the forefront. And that is, of course, the work that Elections Canada is doing all the time. But that is the reason I think that it's so important to not only talk about it, but, take a moment to say, okay, this is actually what we're doing instead. Yeah,
Cameron, there is a media ecosystem that will give this legitimacy, whether it's legitimate or not, and whether we talk about it or not. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on how do you deal with something like this when you see it?
I mean, it's happening, but I'm not prepared to draw any conclusions from it yet. I'm inclined to agree with James on both his points, actually, in terms of, mostly in terms of what he said at the end about people getting involved. Yeah. And I believe, and I've long believed, that there's an apathy problem when it comes to politics in Canada. I think that is true across the board, provincially and federally. And as someone who got involved in politics very young, got to know a lot of other young people who got involved because they cared about something. Either they cared about a specific issue or they cared about changing the country more broadly. You actually really can do a lot if you get involved in a political party at the local level, in a youth commission, in another commission, in your riding. And hopefully people who hold these strong views can translate them into action, especially right now in a campaign, but also outside of campaigns. Right. And then separately from that, you've heard me say before, I'm not a huge fan of obsessing over polls. Obviously, we can't ignore them. The trend lines are things that we, as analysts, talk about, and of course that political parties spend a lot of time focusing on. But maybe it's a reminder that we keep that conversation entirely separate, not you, but generally speaking, we keep that conversation separate and focus as much as possible on the substance of the issues and the content that the party leaders are bringing forward, because I think there has been a trend over time, especially in the US and Canada, to spend a lot of time talking about polls, on horse race polls on a daily basis, and then the rest of the conversation and the questions that the leaders get on the trail end up being based about the polls. How are you doing today versus how you were doing yesterday, and less about the actual substance and the contrast between what they're proposing.
No, look, I agree with you, and that when there's a change, you need to kind of discuss it, I think, but just everyday sort of thing, it gets a bit repetitive and reductionist, right? But James, Cameron, agree with you. Another Liberal taking an idea from a Conservative in the middle of this campaign.
I'll get it.
What?
Never ends.
Never ends. No.
I can offer him a menu, and it'll be more helpful to our side.
All right.
No thanks.
All right. Look, I do have to make one more reference on polls because it is affecting what is happening with the New Democrats, because they're bleeding support to the Liberals, and Jagmeet Singh is now escalating his attacks against Mark Carney. He was in Saskatoon today, where Carney just held a rally last night.
If you are worried about the deep cuts of Pierre Poilievre and you want to reject Conservatives, and you're also worried that Mark Carney is proposing to cut the things that you care about, vote for a New Democrat. In healthcare.
Singh is alleging a Mark Carney government would make $43 billion in cuts. The CBC's Ashley Burke is traveling with the NDP leader's campaign. Ashley.
David, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh in Saskatoon targeting the exact same riding as the Liberals. Singh attacking leader Mark Carney, saying that he would make massive cuts, including to health care, to balance Canada's operational spending budget within 3 years. Carney firing back, saying no, he won't cut health care. He's promised to maintain transfers to the provinces. But Singh says maintaining spending is freezing spending, and he calls that a cut because he says spending will not grow with inflation and the rising needs of the aging population. This battle all playing out the night after both campaigns held rallies in Saskatoon West, just a few kilometers from one another. Both parties are trying to break into the province's Conservative fortress that they've both been shut out of in the past 2 federal elections. Singh wants to tap into the momentum the NDP saw provincially in the fall election, where the NDP almost doubled its seat count. David?
All right, thank you, Ashley. This is CBC's Ashley Burke in Saskatoon. Well, Mark Carney is also in Pierre Poilievre's crosshairs today. Here's what the Conservative leader alleged today about his Liberal rival.
Mark Carney is famous for plagiarizing. Of course, he plagiarized his way through university. He's now plagiarizing Justin Trudeau. Trudeau said in 2017, "We are getting the federal government back into the business of housing." Well, this week, Mark Carney said, "We're getting government back in the business of building affordable homes." So it's almost a precise plagiarization of his protege.
Okay, that's clearly a reference to the allegations about his Mark Carney's PhD at Oxford. He has, of course, a degree from Harvard, a master's from Oxford, a PhD from Oxford. There's been allegations that there was plagiarism in that thesis. The thesis advisor at Oxford says there wasn't. It's fine. The university stands by the degree. You can assess that how you want. One last point to offer here on the NDP. What I am told is at some point tonight, the party will be releasing a video with their endgame messaging for this campaign, where they're going to make the pitch essentially for a minority government, a Carney minority government, and elect as many New Democrats as you can to hold them accountable to stop the cuts and prevent Pierre Poilievre from getting power. So we're going to see. All right, James, I'll come to you. That is going to be the message in the video tonight. And then Jagmeet Singh is speaking at the Broadband Institute conference here in Toronto tomorrow. You're not convinced, I'm guessing, by this pitch, James Moore.
Well, look at the script of what you just rolled through, David,
Yeah.
right? You just said that Jagmeet Singh in the press conference that you just showed of him today in Saskatoon saying, can't trust Mark Carney because he's going to put $43 billion in cuts. But make sure he's prime minister so that I can keep him in office. Like, what is it? Like, what is it? And this is why, New Democrat votes are going down. And it's not just, like you said in the macro, that it's net accretive for the Liberal Party. And perhaps that's true in parts of Ontario. But I can tell you out here in British Columbia, that's not the case. If you look at where the seat projections are in British Columbia, mid-North Island and Vancouver Island, you look at up north in ridings like Skeena, which was rock-solid New Democrat when Nathan Cullen was a member of Parliament there for over a decade. There are parts of British Columbia where they just, even though Jagmeet Singh has a seat in British Columbia, he probably is going to lose his own seat. Where out here on the West Coast, where people just don't want anything to do with this guy because, again, the incoherence. He literally held a press conference today saying that Mark Carney can't be trusted because he can get put in cutbacks. And then he's going to throw in the towel like Kathleen Wynne did in the provincial campaign there a couple cycles ago and say, even though you can't trust Mark Carney, I trust Mark Carney, and I think you should be prime minister with me supporting him. What is that?
Well, maybe
That's not credible.
Well, maybe I didn't explain it right. I think it's basically he'll never support Pierre Poilievre. So if it is Carney, elect New Democrats to hold him accountable. Not necessarily. I take your point. I'm just making sure I didn't give you a false impression on that.
But I imagine people can do the math, right? Elect a minority parliament, make sure it's not here. Well, ipso facto, I know what that means, right?
Yep. No, look, I take your point. Andrew, what do you think of this? The 2 points, like where the NDP seem to want to make their closing argument in this campaign, but also again coming back to the attack on Carney directly from Poilievre at his lectern today.
Yeah, so I mean, what I think you see the NDP honing in on is where they think they can win seats and what that electorate looks like. And it is an electorate that actually Pierre Poilievre's messaging that you showed just now shows why a lot of New Democrat voters do not want that guy anywhere close to power. And I think why a lot of people turned against Pierre Poilievre. It is that snarkiness, it's that nastiness, it's that meanness, it's that pettiness. And people just go, is that really what we want? Mark Carney seems like a, sensible kind of slightly out of touch central banker guy. Is that a better place for people to park right now? And I guess what Singh needs to do is he's got to be very careful because James has obviously picked apart that argument. But the messaging that you need a third party, whether it's the Bloc in Quebec, whether it's the NDP elsewhere. Frankly, this is very much what Reform ran on back in the 90s. That you need people who actually have a strong belief system to keep the Liberal Party honest. And that's the message I think that Singh is trying to hone in on. Is it too late?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it's midway through the campaign. Maybe he can reposition and get that to land. We'll see.
Yeah, Sherelle, I wonder because with the expectations growing in the public mind that the Liberals may win this and it may be a majority, it seems like the closing argument from the NDP, for sure, maybe from the Bloc, is what kind of opposition do you want? What kind of parliament do you want? I don't know if that's a compelling pitch or not, but that's where it seems to be going.
Yeah, I don't know how compelling a pitch it is, but it does possibly seem to be the NDP's best play at this point. I mean, look, if they were able to capitalize on the things that they were able to do during the last Parliament, during the supply and confidence agreement with the Liberals, they could say, the reason that you have pharmacare such as it is, the reason that you have dental care, that was us. We were the driving force behind that, so you're welcome. But that's kind of not what people have taken away from that whole episode. It's the NDP propped up the Liberals, kept them in power, and as we all saw, the Parliament itself, the House of Commons, kind of fell into shambles, and absolutely nothing could get done for months. So is that the selling point? I'm not sure. At the beginning of, after the 2021 election, it was, okay, people said that they wanted, the message the parties tried to play off was the people said that they wanted, politicians to work together and cooperate, and that's what we're going to do. It didn't last very long. I don't know if we're going to see the same level of kumbaya when everybody comes back, regardless of what the shape of the House is. So it is a gamble, but it's probably the only one that they have left at this point.
Cameron, I wonder what your thoughts on this kind of a pitch when there is a lot of polling to suggest that people kind of want a majority one way or the other. They would like a majority government to deal with Donald Trump. There's growing preference for that after the last couple of years. Is it hard to make a pitch for minority, and what does that say about the state of the end game of the NDP campaign here?
I think people spend less time thinking about whether they want a minority or a majority, and they respond more to who is authentic, who has a message and a vision that I can believe in that responds to the things I care about. I don't think regular people are calculating whether they want a majority or minority government and which third or fourth party is going to be best positioned to prop them up or not. So I don't understand what this pitch is. I think it's defeatist. I think it comes across as defeatist. And if I were them, I would do my best to offer a passionate, plea for social justice and progressive values and economic investment in working people and labor unions and all the things that people know them to be. But I honestly don't really know what the NDP is offering in this election. Objectively speaking, I really don't. On the Conservatives, as Andrew pointed out, that clip really demonstrates the problem, because he can't make a point without sounding like he is trying to insult his chief opponent. And I think for most people who are just being introduced to Mark Carney or have maybe heard about him before, he's almost perfectly made for this moment to lead the country through an economic crisis. And the way the Conservative Party talks, the Conservative leader talks about him, does not address his abilities or his capacity to lead the country through this critical time. It's just the same old playbook that may have worked under the previous leader, but will not likely work under this one.
Andrew, you want to quickly get in?
Well, look, I mean, listening to what Cameron says, I think this also demonstrates what the problem is with the Liberal Party. There is a dismissiveness and an arrogance that creeps in every time it looks like they're going to get a majority government. And that does cause, in some parts of the country, for people to go, no, you're right, we've actually got to get back to this being a change election. In other places, the question is what type of change? And to say that we should only be focused on, the national race ignores the fact that people are represented by MPs across this country. Yeah. And a lot of people feel attached to those MPs. Some MPs they think are good, some MPs they think aren't so good. That makes a big difference. And, I think that that's part of what they're trying to refocus the campaign on. Should Don Davis be reelected? Should Matthew Green be reelected? Should, work your way through that list. That's the question they want on those local ballots. And that's a proposition that worked for the provincial NDP in Ontario to be able to hold their 17 seats despite the poor showing that they ended up with on the overall ballot count.
Okay. All right, we've got to leave it there. We're out of time. James, if you get on a flight now, you can be here for the broadband speech tomorrow if you want to. We'll see if he can convince you that this is a good closing argument. You never know. You hear it in person, it might work.
Yeah, I'll be busy washing my hair one hair at a time.
Well, I can never use that excuse. All right, we got to say goodbye. Andrew Thompson, James Moore, Sherelle Evelyn, and Cameron Ahmad. Still lots more to come on Power and Politics, though. Just ahead, we'll ask the top Democrat on the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee how she makes sense of Trump's tariff plan. Plus, we'll ask a former Liberal Justice Minister why he's endorsed candidates from the Bloc Québécois and the Liberals. And our panel of veteran political journalists is here to talk about the key moments on the campaign trail today and throughout the week. U.S. markets ended the day in the red despite historic gains yesterday as the reality of U.S. President Donald Trump's trade war continues to set in. The Dow, the NASDAQ, the S&P 500 all fell between 2 to 4 percentage points. Markets have been in a tailspin ever since last week when Trump announced tariffs on nearly every single country, inhabited or not, in the world. And he then paused some of those tariffs yesterday. Trump told his cabinet today that he expects his plan will work out, even with tariffs on China now at 145%.
All we're doing is putting it back in shape. We're resetting the table. And I'm sure that we'll be able to get along very well. I have great respect for President Xi. He's been, in a true sense, he's been a friend of mine for a long period of time. And I think that we'll end up working out something that's very good for both countries.
Okay, if you're having trouble keeping up, join the club. But the CBC's Katie Simpson is here to help us with this because this is what she does all day, every day, all night, every night. So, Katie, another volatile day in Washington. Walk us through the ups and downs today.
You said club. Are we going to talk about the Pink Pony Club again?
No, not today.
Bring that up again? Not today? I got a lot of email about that. No. So, again, another volatile day, in part because Donald Trump continues to escalate the trade war with China, the world's biggest exporter. The White House clarifying that even though Donald Trump had said yesterday the new tariff rate for China was going to be 125% because China continues to retaliate, well, in fact, is actually going up to 145% because there was a previously announced 20% tariff on China that the White House hadn't previously accounted for. So that's staying put. So that bumps it up to 145. And so that is what is making investors nervous. And you're seeing more red on the markets and sort of a clawback of some of those gains that took place yesterday. Have a listen to what Donald Trump is saying. He held a cabinet meeting today and invited the cameras in. It went on for more than an hour in terms of the portion that was televised. And every cabinet minister was called on, or every cabinet secretary was called on to speak, and each and every single one offering intense praise and compliments toward the leadership of Donald Trump. And in that meeting, Donald Trump sort of, tried to calm things as he talked about this intensifying trade war specifically with China.
I think it's going to work out, hopefully well. They're very big. It's hard to get over, if you're me, what they've done to our country. They've destroyed our economic base to a large extent. The good news is we're very vibrant, and we're going to get it back fast.
So the members of the Trump administration at this event talking about how many world leaders have reached out, teams from different countries around the world, more than 75 officials from more than 75 countries reaching out. Other officials saying they're expecting a lot of traffic to the White House from world leaders over the next 3 to 4 weeks as all of these different countries are coming in to try to escape Donald Trump's tariff. Trump also opened the possibility to extending the pause on those country-specific tariffs, and he said that perhaps if a deal is good enough, a country might be able to get out of that 10% baseline tariff. Because right now, the way things are working, Donald Trump has imposed a baseline 10% tariff on across the vast majority of all the goods that are coming into the United States at this point in time. There are some exceptions. There are some sort of like changes. You look at Canada and Mexico. There are different tariffs that apply to Canada and Mexico with different sets of exemptions. But all other countries are sort of trying to deal with this. Most other countries are trying to deal with this. And while, those country-specific tariffs, they were set at much higher rates. Those are paused for now. There's still this baseline 10% tariff. That's not something that American consumers or importers are going to want to pay. So you're still seeing that volatility on the markets, and it was another one of those days where everything closed down. There were some sell-offs.
They brought in so many different tariffs, even they can't keep track of how much China is being tariffed. I mean, that's how chaotic this whole thing is. And because of this and the chaos on the markets, Katie, Democrats are calling for an investigation into the president's actions yesterday and all of that impact that had.
Yeah, so here's the thing. We all pay very close attention, at least us in Washington, pay close attention to Donald Trump's Truth Social page. And Democrats are calling for an investigation sort of into what was going on behind the scenes around the tariff pause and what happened to the markets. Is this a case of market manipulation? When stocks opened yesterday, the day that the full tariff regime was finally in effect, it was another volatile opening to the markets. At 9:33, Donald Trump was posting on Truth Social saying, "Be cool, everything is going to work out fine." Then by 9:37, 4 minutes later, he tweeted, "This is a good time to buy DJT," putting his initials, Donald John Trump, right there in the post. And then from there, we do know that Donald Trump and his team have revealed it was yesterday morning that Donald Trump made the decision that there was going to be the pause. He said he'd been thinking about it for a couple of days, but confirmed that he made the decision, wrote the announcement, which was also posted on Truth Social at 1:18 in the afternoon. But once that post was made, the markets did soar. Democrats think something fishy is going on. Have a listen to Chuck Schumer.
What exactly was the purpose of this post? Why did he feel the need to add his initials to this particular post? Was it a signal to his friends and family that he was going to pause the tariffs so they should buy low, knowing the market would boom? Was this another stand back and stand by? We may never know. We may never know. But we need to find out, and it must be investigated.
So Democrats, a number of Democrats are supporting that idea that what went down be investigated. Donald Trump had reporters in the Oval Office for close to an hour, and he did take a series of questions, but no one asked about market manipulation allegations until everyone had multiple questions, and then at the end someone started screaming, "What about market manipulation allegations?" But he'd answered questions for a while, and no one answered till then. Some members of his team have been asked about it, about what was going on sort of behind the scenes, and whether these allegations, there's any merit to them. Peter Navarro, who is a senior Trump White House trade advisor, he sort of laughed it off, saying he wouldn't dignify that kind of question with any sort of analytics.
All right, Katie, thank you so much. Till tomorrow's chaotic crisis. That's the CBC's Katie Simpson in Washington.
I work Sunday to Thursday. No.
We'll see.
I am
no days off in Trump's Washington.
No, I'm going to that bar behind me. Bye.
All right, Katie, thanks so much. CBC's Katie Simpson. Well, in the U.S. Senate, Democrats are still vowing to force a vote on limiting the president's tariff powers.
I'm done. Bye.
7 Republicans have signed onto the Trade Review Act, which will require the president to notify and justify tariffs to Congress. This afternoon, one of those Republicans told the Senate that this is about taking back control.
I believe it is yet another example of Congress choosing to cede its powers to the executive branch. Measures that are as important as these should be considered by the 535 elected individuals that are in tune with the American people, rather than vesting that with just one individual acting unilaterally.
But with President Donald Trump threatening to veto that bill, what do senators fear could happen to America's relationship with allies? Jean Shaheen is the senior senator from New Hampshire and the top Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and she joins me now. Senator, welcome to the show. It's good to speak with you.
It's to be with you.
Up here in Canada and around the world, we're all trying to understand why Donald Trump keeps imposing tariffs, then pausing tariffs, saying they're permanent, but he's open to negotiating. How do you make sense of all of this?
Well, it's hard to make sense of the off again, on again tariffs, and the fact that they are aimed at our closest allies and neighbors. As we know, in New Hampshire, Canada has been a true friend and ally of the United States, and we have a lot of people in New Hampshire who have families in Canada. We have businesses that go back and forth over the border, and it's very upsetting to see the impact of these tariffs on the businesses in my state and across this country.
Canada was sort of spared from the chaos of these reciprocal tariffs, as the president calls them, this week, but there's still 25% tariffs on auto, on steel, on aluminum, on trade they consider non-compliant with the Continental Trade Agreement. Canada's put in retaliatory tariffs on that. Howard Lutnick suggested yesterday Canada might want to drop those, or it could get worse. I mean, what do you make of that? What do you think Canada's response should be here?
Well, I think it's not just the tariffs, it's the uncertainty that's created. I hear from businesses across New Hampshire that they're not sure how to plan for the future. They're not sure if they can go ahead and expand and invest because they're not sure what the tariffs are going to be tomorrow, because we don't know what the president's going to do. But the other issue is there are a lot of companies that have been affected by the tariffs, not because of the tariffs themselves, but because of the impact that that's had on the relationship with Canada and with their business partners in Canada. So I was at a bakery last week in New Hampshire. It makes sugar-free baked goods and candies. 85% of their business has been with Canada, and those orders were all canceled after the president came out with his tariffs. We have another company that was buying buses in Canada because Canada makes the buses that so many places in the United States use. He canceled half of his order because the increased costs made it unaffordable. And we get a lot of tourists in New Hampshire. We're a big tourism state, as is Maine and our neighbors in New England. And what we've seen is that the Canadian tourists who normally come down to Hampton Beach to enjoy the ocean have canceled a lot of those reservations because of the impact on the relationship. And long term, that's a very bad thing, both for the United States and I think for Canada as well.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if that changes, like if this survives Trump, like does Trumpism persist after Trump? But we're in the middle of the federal election here, and you know, there is sort of the through line in the competition is that Canada doesn't feel like it can rely on the United States anymore, or at least not for now, and looking abroad to reestablish relationships with other trading partners and allies they consider reliable. And I just wonder what you think all of this is doing to your country's standing in the world. How do you view it?
I think it's very troubling. I serve as the top Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and we're seeing the impacts around the world from the tariffs, from the rollback in foreign assistance programs, from a failure to recognize the importance of responding to the disinformation campaigns that are coming from our adversaries, from China, from Iran, from North Korea, and from Russia. So I think it has significant impact, and I'm hopeful that our allies are going to understand that all Americans don't have that approach. We appreciate the allies and partners that have fought together, that have worked together since World War II, and that we can continue those relationships.
The president is being toughest on China. I think it's up to 145% tariffs now. And I understand the desire to contain China as an economic threat, as a non-market economy, as an autocracy, and as a military threat. But as it gets harder and harder to do business with the United States, and China could make it easier to do business with China, there is a potential for backfire here, potentially. Do you think this could end up making China stronger?
Well, it certainly is driving some of our longtime allies into China's arms in terms of trading. We have seen that with South Korea and Japan, who have met with China in the last couple of weeks to talk about a trade arrangement. So I do think it creates significant challenges going forward.
I wonder, you know, there are attempts at the Senate and in the House to try to rein the president in here, because properly, trade and tariffs belong to Congress, though he's used an executive order to sort of do end runs around everybody. He's threatening to veto it, the president is, should something come to it. There were some senators, Republican, who voted to kind of rebuke the president on this. Do you see with the veto threat and the way the House is captured by Speaker Johnson and the MAGA wing of the party, do you see a legislative option here to rein in the president?
I just came from the floor of the Senate where Senator Murkowski, your Canada's neighbor to the north in Alaska, was talking about the importance of Congress reestablishing our authority over tariffs. I do think that as people hear from our constituents, that that's going to have an impact on how Congress responds. What we're estimating the impact of these tariffs is going to be on the average household in the United States is an additional $3,800 a year that people are going to pay in what is essentially a tax. So this is really the biggest tax increase that we've seen in the United States as the result of these tariffs in decades. And I think people are going to react to that because they're going to see it in the cost of their groceries. They're going to see it in the cost of fuel. They're going to see it reflected in housing costs, in everything they buy at the grocery store. And as much as we all want to rein in the PRC in China and what they're doing across the world, so much of what we buy in the United States and in other parts of the world comes from China that we have to think about how we phase in this dramatic tariff tax on people in a way that doesn't undermine the goal of what we're trying to accomplish in terms of weakening the PRC.
You know, some senior Canadian officials have suggested in conversations I've had with them, Senator, that Donald Trump is a 78-year-old man who can't run again, so he's really got nothing to lose here politically. The pressure point is maybe the midterms. Because the Congress people and senators do want to run again. Is that the timeline before this potentially ends? Do you think he can last that long with the economic uncertainty? Because he seems a little bit unfazed by it, and where he's not running again, the political pain doesn't seem to hurt him. Is it going to take the threat of midterm defeats to get Congress to act?
Well, I think it's unfortunate that the president has suggested that he is oblivious to the pain that these tariffs are going to inflict on Americans and on American business. And it's having an impact, as I'm sure you've seen, on markets, as we've looked at the very volatile stock market we've seen both in the United States and in other parts of the world. It's having an impact on our ability to sell our bonds, which the conventional wisdom is that's one of the things that caused the president to delay the tariffs. But it still creates uncertainty. That is bad for the business climate. It's bad for the average family who are going to pay these increased costs. And ultimately, it's bad for the world economy. So I think it's that public reaction, that economic impact, that's ultimately going to influence what the president does.
Senator, I know you have to go. I just want to squeeze in one last question if I can. Donald Trump, in the initial tariffs he imposed on Canada and Mexico, he talked about the border and fentanyl and migrants crossing the border, and that was his emergency justifying the tariff action. You've co-written a letter along with a Republican senator looking for further strengthening of your northern border, our southern border. I don't believe it's for the same reasons as the president. I just wonder, why are you calling for that? What are the issues you see on the Canada-U.S. border that you want to see addressed with this?
What our letter asks for is investment in technology so we can address some of the concerns about fentanyl and other drugs that are crossing the border. And I appreciate that it's crossing not just from Canada into the United States, but from the United States into Canada. I've had a chance to meet with your foreign minister, Mademoiselle Jolie, and we have talked about how we can better partner to address some of those concerns. You know, in northern New Hampshire, we have a border station that gets its power from Canada. And I know that along the southern border of Canada, you have a lot of those cooperative arrangements with the United States. So it's in our interest, both Canada and the United States, to work together to address these problems, as opposed to setting up oppositional relationships that don't accomplish what we all want to accomplish.
Yeah, and I certainly think that's the view of the Canadian government as well. Senator Jean Shaheen, we do appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us on the show today.
Thank you very much.
All right, just ahead on Power and Politics, why a veteran Liberal Party member is throwing his support behind candidates from multiple parties ahead of this month's federal election. I'm going to speak to Irwin Cotler coming up after this. Well, with just over 2 weeks until Election Day, there have been some unusual cross-party endorsements this week. One former Liberal MP and Cabinet Minister, Irwin Cotler, has shown his support behind a Bloc Québécois candidate in Quebec City. However, Cotler has also endorsed the Liberal candidate in Cotler's former riding of Mount Royal. But then yesterday, the Conservative candidate in that same riding posted a video on social media from the Cotler's front yard, standing beside Irwin Cotler's wife, thanking her for her support. His cross-party endorsements is former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, Irwin Cotler. Mr. Cotler, it's good to see you again.
Good to speak with you, David.
Okay, so you are a former Liberal Minister of Justice. You have endorsed the Bloc Québécois candidate. I want to get to that in just a second. But help me understand what's happening in Mount Royal, because you've endorsed Anthony Housefather, but there's a sign for Neil Oberman, the Conservative, outside your house. What's happening, Mr. Cotler?
Well, my wife has endorsed Neil Oberman. He actually was over here the other day. We're also friends, but my support for Anthony stands. He's been a former student of mine, a long-standing colleague. I supported him in every previous election. I'm supporting him now. As I said, my wife is supporting Neil Oberman. We are a plural household, mutually respectful, and so that's why there may appear to be confusion, but there's no confusion. We're just supporting different candidates.
Okay, so you're canceling each other out in a way, is how that's going to go when it comes to Election Day.
She's always been her own independent person, my wife, so she speaks with her own voice.
I gotcha. Well, it's just, you see a Conservative sign outside of your house, given your background, people wonder. And the battle in that riding between Mr. Housefather and Mr. Oberman, the issue of Israel, what's happening on campuses, what's happening in Gaza, it's a very divisive one playing out in that particular race. I mean, is that driving your thought process on this election in any way?
No, it doesn't drive my thought process. My support for Anthony really arrives of the fact that I think he's been an exemplary constituency MP. He was better than I was. He just really responds to every constituent from whatever part of the riding. So he's been exemplary in that regard. And I believe he warrants support regardless of party because he's such a good MP.
Okay, so just to build on the pluralism approach that you've adopted in your household, Mr. Cotler, you've also voiced your support for the Bloc Québécois MP, Alexis Brunel de Sepp. Why are you offering your endorsement, even though it's not a riding you live in, why are you offering your endorsement to a member from the Bloc?
Well, somewhat for the same reason. Alexis, who I've known from the time he first was appointed to Parliament, has been an exemplary parliamentarian. He's been a strong voice for human rights, both domestically and internationally. He's been an exemplary member, vice chair of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Human Rights, which I regard as one of the more important committee memberships in Parliament. And so I felt that he deserved for support. I've always put a principle above party. When I was a member of Parliament, I worked across party lines. I was close friends with and colleagues with his father, Gilles Duceppe, who recently visited me in my home last Saturday. I was visited both by Yvan-François Barrette, the head of the Bloc Québécois today, as well as with Alexis, and accompanying them was also Richard Marceau, who was the Bloc Québécois, was a justice critic when I was Minister of Justice and Attorney General, a sharp justice critic, but we've since become very close friends. Right. So I believe you can be friends across party lines and you can support people, particularly now that I'm no longer in politics, who represent positions of principle and policy that I think that's what makes Parliament the best place it can be.
Well, it's a rare moment of, you talk about multi-partisanship and cross-partisanship. It's happening with you, right? With people coming to see you, and this is a rare thing in politics right now. And you're voting for the Liberal MP, you're voting for Anthony Housefather because of your personal relationship. You are a former Liberal. But, I'm reading the Canadian press reporting that you have not yet thrown your support behind any federal leader, including Mark Carney. How should people view that, Mr. Cotler, that even though you are a former Liberal cabinet minister supporting the local Liberal candidate, you aren't yet ready to endorse the federal Liberal leader?
Well, I'm not part of the political arena anymore. I'm the international chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. We're basically a pursuit of justice, a human rights center, etc. So I'm looking to see what are the positions of the leadership and the Conservative, Liberal Prime Minister Carney. What are the positions on these foreign policy principal issues? Justice in Ukraine, Sudan, which is witnessing the second genocide in the 21st century, the greatest humanitarian catastrophe in the world today. Our Raoul Wallenberg Center has been very much involved in the Sudan Accountability Initiative. I'm looking about the Iranian sevenfold threat matters with regard to political prisoners. I represent that here. I work a little bit with, as well with Alexis Duceppe on political prisoners. Iran today has political prisoners that represent arbitrary detention of dual nationals. So that's an important issue. Canada's a leader in regard to declaration of arbitrary detention. Yes, also, of course, the Middle East, but it's a whole foreign policy principles and policy. And so as that unfolds, I will take a position, but it won't be on party lines. It'll be on lines of principle and policy.
Just as a final point, Mr. Cotler, on the Middle East, on Israel, on what's happening with Gaza, where things have they've ratcheted back up again. Mr. Carney was asked about this at a campaign stop earlier this week. Someone shouted something at him from the crowd, and his answer made it sound like he considered what was happening to be a genocide against the Palestinian people, though he later clarified that. We've seen a statement from Benjamin Netanyahu saying Canada has always sided with civilization, so should Mr. Carney, but instead of supporting Israel in its fight against Hamas, he's attacking the only Jewish state. Do you have any thoughts on that? Does that what do you make of that response from the Israeli Prime Minister at this moment in this campaign?
Well, I just heard it now for the first time, and I don't really take positions on that as well. My approach with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict of long standing as I support two states for two peoples, not as an idle slogan, but the mutual acknowledgement of each other's legitimacy. And I think at this point, if we care about the Palestinian people, we have to understand that regrettably, Hamas has not only taken Israelis hostage, but it's taken the Palestinian Gazans hostage. And what we need is a governance in Gaza that will represent a regional coalition involving Egyptians, Jordanians, Palestinians, etc. We have to, I think, our main objective should be, yes, an independent Palestinian state, but a democratic, rights-protecting, rule of law Palestinian state. We don't need another second terrorist authoritarian state in the Middle East. So if you care about Palestinian rights, you should want an independent Palestinian state, but a democratic, rights-protecting one.
Irwin Cotler, we always appreciate your time. It's always good to talk to you, sir. Thank you for joining us today.
And good talking with you, David. Keep well.
All right, during this week, Conservatives just happened to be gathering here in Ottawa for an annual event. It's the Canada Strong and Free Conference, formerly known as the Manning Conference. And can you guess what's dominating the conversations there? Why? The election campaign, of course. So Kate McKenna went there, spent the day speaking to Conservatives at the event. She's here in the studio to tell us all about what she heard. Kate, what did you hear at this conference?
Well, the campaign was definitely the main subject in corners, everybody talking about the polls. And I have to tell you, David, the vibe was very different than what it was at the same conference last year when they were more than 10 points ahead in the polls. Now people are expressing real concern about how the campaign is going, how it's being run. Here's a listen to some of what I heard.
I'm a little disappointed, actually. I think that he should be bringing out some bigger guns than he is. There's lots of issues that Canadians are concerned about that aren't getting talked about. And I personally think he should show some more courage. I feel like he's fighting a fight against the Liberals rather than truly putting forward his platform.
Well, Liberals have very strong propaganda machine. They know how to trick people and convince the public and get their vote. This is not what Conservatives are doing.
So what should they be doing differently?
Well, they can hire more people, spend more money, speak to public, be more efficient in public, to introduce their plans, talk about their plans, their policy.
I'm pretty happy with it right now. I know there are things here and there where people always disagree internally, and internal conflicts usually cause issues, but I think for the most part they're doing a good job of keeping things level and sticking to their main talking points and not really straying from what is kind of not being talked about. So trying to stay relevant to what people are concerned about, which is ultimately the goal of campaigning.
Some of the Conservatives that I spoke with also expressed concern about that event becoming a political liability for the campaign, particularly because there were a number of speakers on that list who are closely aligned with Donald Trump. And this, of course, is a window of time where Pierre Poilievre's campaign is taking great pains to not be associated with Donald Trump at all. And sources did tell me that Conservatives actively working on the campaign were told not to go. And of course, they often would go. Last year, Pierre Poilievre spoke at this thing, right? So they were told to go knock on doors instead. And I did also notice, David, a few kind of last-minute changes to this agenda. One of the key members of Donald Trump's campaign team, Chris Lysidova, was set to speak on cryptocurrency, but that entire panel was dropped. A spokesperson for the event would not say why that happened. And then also one of the key architects of Donald Trump's tariff plans, Robert Lighthizer, is a keynote tomorrow, and media are not allowed to cover that event.
Yeah, interesting. He's here in the middle of a trade war. And Chris LaCivita and Susie Wiles were the two people who sort of ran the campaign for Donald Trump. So that's an interesting change of the schedule. But some big political names who were there also have featured in this trade battle. Who's in the lineup still?
Well, Danielle Smith was the star of the show today, and she arrived and she gave a speech that was very much centered on energy and extracting more energy and building more. A very similar message to what we're hearing from Pierre Poilievre in the campaign, you know, that Canada's best defense in a trade war is to be as economically resilient as possible. Right. She also gave a full-throated endorsement of Pierre Poilievre. Have a listen to what she had to say.
No one's surprised that about who I'm voting for, and I'm very, very pleased to have seen that he has massive turnout at all of his rallies, no matter where he goes across the country. So I think that's a pretty good indication of the way he's breaking through. What I've observed so far with the current Prime Minister is he says one thing in French, one thing's in English, one thing in private, one thing in public, and then another thing in Eastern Canada and a different thing in Western Canada. So I have no idea what kind of Prime Minister he will be post-election if he should win.
There was another thing I kind of noticed in what she was saying. First, she gave kind of a keynote address, and then she did a scrum afterwards, and she was kind of pressed on the subject of national unity. And she was more muted on that than she had been in the past, previously saying, you know, there could be a national unity crisis if the Liberals get in. Now saying there could be problems if the Liberals get in and nothing changes. So a slight change in tone from her, but really pushing the message that whoever forms the next government, she prefers it to be Pierre Poilievre, but whoever does it needs to work with Alberta on resource development.
Okay. All right, Kate, thanks so much. That's the CBC's Kate McKenna. Coming up, our panel of veteran Ottawa journalists is here to talk about the key moments on the campaign trail today, including this one.
Well, I'm sorry, but you can't believe everything you read in the Globe and Mail.
All right, find out what led to that criticism from the Liberal Party leader and how the Globe and Mail Ottawa Bureau Chief Robert Fife will respond to that comment from Mark Carney. Coming up next. Today on the campaign trail, Liberal leader Mark Carney faced some scrutiny over photos taken of him with members of the leadership of a pro-Beijing lobby group. This is a photo that was posted to the Jiangsu Commerce Council of Canada's website. That is Mark Carney with the president of that organization. There were several others posted from the same event. Now, the Globe and Mail first reported about these photos this morning, and later at his press conference today, Mark Carney was asked about them. Here was his response.
You can't believe everything you read in the Globe and Mail. So in your question, and I guess in the article in question, you said I had a meeting with whatever your term was, Beijing group. I've never heard of this group, okay? Never heard of this group. Certainly didn't have a set-up meeting with this group. Full stop. So check your sources before you write things like that, okay? Or your colleagues do. I'm a politician. I go to events where there are hundreds and thousands over the course of a day of different people there. That is not a meeting. If somebody happens to be in the room, takes a picture with me, that's not a meeting.
Okay, I want to bring in our panel of veteran journalists, as we've been doing every Thursday during this campaign. Robert Fife, oddly enough, he is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail. He happens to be here, along with Mia Rabson, the Deputy Parliamentary Bureau Chief of the Canadian Press, and Joël Denis Bellevance, the Parliamentary Bureau Chief for La Presse. Okay, Bob, I do want to talk to you about the story you wrote with Stephen Chase. You saw the Carney comments there. Before we get to that, I do want to show a statement from the Liberal Party about the photos. This is what they put out. It repeats a lot of what Mr. Carney said, that he attends multiple events where he meets and is photographed with hundreds or thousands of people over the course of the day. That's the case here too, as no specific meeting with that organization has ever been organized or taken. The web post referenced in the Globe and Mail is inaccurate. So is the suggestion that Mr. Carney had any such in-depth discussion. We have reached out to the organization correcting the record and asked that they remove such claims immediately. So Bob, you're here, you're at the center of this. What's your reaction to what Carney said today in the statement from the party?
Well, first of all, we never said that there was a meeting. We said that this organization met him, and according to their website, they had an in-depth discussion. Mm-hmm. That's the story, and which, by the way, that wasn't the focus of the story. The focus of the story is on the Liberal candidate in the riding that was replaced by another Liberal
Etobicoke North.
I know it's
Union Markham.
Markham Union.
Yeah, sorry, my apologies.
And this man named Peter Yen is a former deputy police chief. We checked him out, and he is being connected to Beijing-friendly organizations, including this organization who met with Mr. Carney. They echo and repeat the lines of the Chinese Communist Party. The other groups that Mr. Yen met with were the Chinese Freemasons, which talks about annexation of Taiwan. He's been celebrated and had many meetings with the Chinese consulate, which we now know from the public inquiry into foreign interference that the Chinese consulate is the key organizing body for all of these proxy groups that try to influence politicians. So that was the point of our story. But here's the thing I want to talk about, and I'm glad Mr. Carney raised this, because here's the reason why. This same group, if you go to the website, after they met him, they wrote a laudatory thing about how great Mark Carney is, how great he is and going to improve Chinese-Canadian relations. So what did we find out on Monday? The site committee, which looks into federal election interference, said that WeChat and China has been trying to mold public opinion involving Mr. Carney. What are they molding? Nice things about him, what a tough guy he is, how he can take on the Americans. So I guess the point here is, has anybody learned anything from the foreign interference inquiry or not? This is the strategy of China to try to influence no matter which political party you are. And rather than trying to attack the media, why doesn't he just say, look, we have to do a better job of dealing with these kind of organizations that are trying to influence politicians.
Right, so the issue there, just to follow up with the candidate, and this is obviously a known and repeated over time association. The moments with Mr. Carney are events he's had for his leadership where people show up and he poses for photos. It wasn't that kind of sit-down orchestrated meeting that maybe his candidate
and of
would
course
have done
we
in the
never
past.
said that.
Right, no, I just wanted to make sure that people understood. Okay, so have anything else back to you guys from the Liberals since then? I've been told they've sent a letter that I've got a copy of here to this group asking them to take it all down and change things on their webpage. I mean, what's the latest at your end?
Yeah, they told me the same thing. Funny thing, they didn't mention asking them to take down all the laudatory stuff they said about Mark Carney, though.
Well, okay. All right. Well, all right. Let's go bigger picture from that. JD, your thoughts on where we are in this election campaign right now since we last met? I mean, Carney getting a little bit testy with the media there today because of this. We've seen, pens for media in other places. What are your thoughts on where this campaign is right now?
Well, it's not moving, in any direction other than pointing towards a Liberal victory on April 28th. And that's courtesy of what? Of Donald Trump. So the shadow of Donald Trump is still very much big on this election campaign, and it has been the case since the beginning. I expect it to be the case until the end. For better or for worse, I think probably for worse because of what the impact has had his action has had on stock markets for a little while. But I think that already people are, leaders are already looking forward towards next week when we'll have the French and English debate in Montreal. And that, I think, will remain the last hope for anybody to change the course of this election campaign.
That debate is going to have to be something, Mia, based on where the polls have gone. I mean, what are your thoughts on where things are right now?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with JD. We haven't seen a lot of movement in the last week. The most movement we've really seen is a little bit more firming up of those votes. The polls are suggesting that people are more sort of locked in to where they're voting. So there's not a lot of room for people to shift. That said, debates sometimes have an impact. The French debate for Mark Carney is probably the more important of the two because of his French skills we know are not strong. He doesn't have a lot of history in political debates, so this is sort of a new thing for him. So that one is really, really critical for him. To this point, Francophones in Quebec seem to be willing to give him the benefit of the doubt for his French. They seem more open to the idea that he's willing to learn. It's already getting better, but he's made a few mistakes in French already. If he makes a big one on debate night, it has happened in the past where that has an impact on votes. And right now for Mr. Carney, he just can't. He needs to hold sort of this coalition he has together of votes from the Liberals, a little bit from the Tories, NDP, and the Bloc.
So Bob, on that, just as a final point on that, Carney could lose the big gains he's poised to make in Quebec with the French debate, but Poilievre needs the English debate to really move things in Ontario and maybe Atlantic Canada, right? So there is that. The upside is all there for the Conservatives.
Yeah, I mean, the problem that Mr. Poilievre has is he's got a pretty solid 38%, and it's staying there. And he's got to move New Democrats away, which that's where they're sitting, or in some blue Liberals away, and that's a real challenge. And you're starting to see a bit of panic here with the Conservatives, particularly Mr. Poilievre. He's starting to get really character assassination. Because he's tried everything else, so now he's trying to chip away at his character, calling him a grifter, saying that his resume is false. All of this sort of stuff.
And trophy titles, like Governor of the Bank of England is a trophy, right?
And that is a very dangerous thing to do when we got somebody south of the border who's used to name-calling people all the time. And one would think you'd want to get away from sounding anywhere like Donald Trump. But to me, that seems like a sign of desperation.
Right. Okay. I want to quickly show you something. The New Democrats have been shifting their message throughout the week, and it's not a subtle thing. It's now official. They are making a move to endgame messaging, making a pitch for a minority government, and they put a video out online. Just have a look at some of this.
A Canada where one party holds all the power means cuts to the very things that make us who we are. Canada works best when we don't just have two parties trading power back and forth. Canada works best when there are enough New Democrats elected to stand up for you, not the billionaires. If you vote NDP, we'll work to build our kind of Canada, just like we always have.
Bob, that is not a pitch.
Please vote for me, please.
That's not a pitch for an NDP government, right? I mean, throughout the video he says, I'll never support Pierre Poilievre, sort of acknowledges it looks like it's Carney. Yeah. You need us there to keep him in check. I mean, what do you think of this move?
Sometimes that might work in a normal election campaign, but I think it's a real challenge now because the threat is not here. The threat is south of the border. And New Democrats are as concerned about their livelihood as a lot of people who are now 43 or 44% who are now supporting Mr. Carney. So I just don't think that message is going to work, and let's see what other thing he's going to try.
We've had 7 elections since 2000. This is the 8th one. We had 5 minority governments in those elections. That's a lot of minority governments. And we had 2 in a row. And I think the appetite now among the electorate is to have a strong majority government for one reason, just so the government has les coups de frange, as we say in French, have enough strong mandate to be able to face Donald Trump and what are the consequences of his actions on Canada. So I don't think that this plea will be heard by anybody except maybe some New Democrats who think that they still have some influence in Ottawa. But I think this is the first admission that this campaign is going nowhere.
He's going to give a speech, Jagmeet Singh, I'm told, at the Broadbent Institute tomorrow, which is, the New Democrat counter to the old Manning conference. Really amplify this message and double down and explain why.
I mean, it's a little desperate. The NDP have had a very bad campaign. They came into it with terrible numbers, not all at their own doing. Part of it is circumstances. But this campaign has been low energy. It has been lacking in new ideas. And if the insistence for the NDP is that, well, vote for us and we will we'll hold them to account and it'll be like it was in the last Parliament. I don't know that anyone would suggest that the last Parliament was actually a good thing. It wasn't working. And Canadians right now, we need not just a strong mandate, we need a government that can actually be decisive and make decisions quickly to respond to what is happening outside. And that's the message he's coming up against.
Right.
He needs to make this pitch because right now the NDP, some polls are suggesting, could be wiped out almost entirely. They had 25 seats when Parliament was dissolved. Some are suggesting they could have less than 5. That is a desperate situation for this party, and that's why he's going to Broadbent tomorrow to make this pitch to say, like, it's sort of a last grasp strategy.
JD, we going to see a video like that in French, starring Mr. Blanchet? Because he's getting squeezed in Quebec much the same way, right? Like, the numbers look rough for him.
The same phenomena that is happening to the NDP is happening also to the Bloc Québécois. And for the Bloc Québécois, Mr. Blanchet's message is harder to pitch because Quebecers want a strong prime minister, and Mr. Blanchet is not applying to be prime minister of Canada. He can be because he's leading a separatist party. So he's trying to find some causes to ignite some support within the national Quebecers. But Quebecers, in drove are ready to vote for the Liberal Party, and that's astounding. That's a turn of events that I did not expect 6 weeks ago because they were ready to show the door to the Liberal Party, the Liberal government, even Justin Trudeau, and now Mr. Blanchet, who was maybe even hoping, measuring not the curtain at Stornoway, but expecting maybe to be able even to be the official opposition. Now this dream is gone.
The vibe on Parliament Hill in the fall was very different than the vibe we're dealing with right now. And Bob, I wonder about this. Like, there's still a couple of weeks left in this whole thing. But the way the fundamentals of this campaign are playing out, you see the polling showing Mr. Poilievre's negatives being pretty bad. He's polling below the party right now. You hear from candidates that he's coming up the doors, especially with women voters. I mean, what would it take for this to pivot back? Because we didn't see it being here 60, 90 days ago. I mean, what would it take for it to flip back?
But people were telling Pierre Poilievre a year ago, stop the nastiness. Stop being a partisan. Stop being an attack dog. You're the prime minister in waiting. Let somebody else be the mean person. And, for a little bit, there was a little tiny bit of period where he tried to show a sense of humor, and he can be a very charming man. But he just kept reverting back to being very partisan. And all the polls show that it turns off women voters.
And older voters, too.
And older voters. They just don't like it. And that's why I was surprised this week when he upped the game again of being really nasty and trying to do character assassination. I don't think that sells.
Yeah.
Not when you've got somebody south of the border who does that all the time.
And not when you're bragging about crowd sizes and sort of demanding respect for the size of your crowds. I mean, there's no doubt those rallies are big. They're momentous for him. They're providing energy to the campaign. But there is one person who was very famous for bragging about crowd sizes south of the border, and that person is persona non grata in Canada.
Well, look, in Canada, Preston Manning used to get very big crowd sizes as well. Did he ever form government?
Yeah, Bernie Sanders is not the president of the United States, and he can pack a crowd, right? So it is what it is. But, I wonder, JD, Bob says, let somebody else be the attack dog. Who else is there in this Conservative campaign? Who's the finance minister in this government? Who would be the foreign affairs minister? Who would be the trade minister?
I was going to raise that point at this precise moment. I think the strategy of the Conservative Party is at fault right now, because if Mr. Poilievre has failed to introduce which team would surround him to be able to govern Canada, it's been one-man show essentially so far for the Conservative Party. Whereas Mr. Carney, it takes time to introduce people around him, and also you've got other ministers who are up front and doing their businesses, like François Champagne, the Minister of Finance, or Mélanie Joly, which was at the NATO summit, or Dominique Leblanc, who's talking to Howard Lutnick. So where's the team behind Mr. Poilievre?
Okay, we got to end it there, though I'd like to keep going, but they're going to take the show away in 24 seconds. So I want to thank Bob Fife, Mia Refs, and Joël Denis Bellevance. I am David Cochrane. Thank you for watching Power and Politics. Remember, we're free, CBC News Network, until May 5th. You can watch the #1 news network wherever you get your cable or stream CBC. And we're live on YouTube, this show, for the remainder of this campaign. We're back in 22 hours. Hannah Mansing Tonight is next on CBC News Network.